Snow drifted gently across the countryside, falling in soft, unhurried patterns as though the sky itself were sleepy. It was late afternoon on the 23rd of December, and the winter roads wound through the hills like pale ribbons of frost. Every tree glimmered with a dusting of white, every hedge bowed politely beneath its icy crown, and the distant horizons seemed blurred by a peaceful veil of drifting flakes. On this quiet road walked a solitary traveler named Lawrence Hartwell. He was wrapped in a long wool coat, its dark fabric powdered with snow, and each breath he exhaled rose into the air like a tiny ghost. His boots crunched steadily across the frozen path, though his steps had grown slower, heavier, and more uncertain as the wind thickened around him. It was supposed to be a simple journey, a few miles to the next village, a warm inn, a hot meal, then onward toward home in time for Christmas Eve. But winter had other plans. The snowfall had deepened, hour by hour, until Lawrence could no longer see more than a few paces ahead. The road itself seemed to disappear into a blur of white, and with every passing minute, the cold pressed harder against him. The wind whispered through the hedgerows like a voice urging him to hurry, yet he could go no faster. He tightened his scarf, drawing it higher across his face. "I just need shelter," he murmured into the wind. "Any shelter." His words drifted away like breath against glass. The snow answered with silence. Lawrence continued onward, guided only by the faint wavering path beneath his boots. The world felt vast and empty, a landscape made of snow and sky. He could hear nothing but the steady beat of his heart and the muffled crunch of his steps. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed before he noticed something strange. A faint glow in the distance. It flickered softly through the swirling snow, warm and golden, like a lantern held inside a frosted window. Lawrence blinked the snowflakes from his lashes, squinting into the storm. There it was again, a warm light. A beacon. Hope stirred in his chest. He quickened his pace as much as the snow allowed. The glow brightened with each step, illuminating the drifting flakes in soft amber hues. Soon the faint outline of a building emerged, a shape rising from the storm like a quiet promise. A lodge. No. An inn. A sign swung gently from an iron bracket near the door, its painted letters barely visible through the snowfall. The Holly Tree Inn. Lawrence felt a wave of relief wash through him. Warm, comforting, almost overwhelming. He reached the door just as the wind rose in a fierce gust, sending snow spiraling around him like a wild dance. With numb fingers, he shoved the door open. Warmth greeted him at once. Not a harsh, sudden heat, but a gentle, soothing warmth that felt like stepping into a memory. The light inside was soft and golden, shaped by the glow of a large stone hearth at the center of the room. Flames crackled quietly, their reflections dancing across polished wooden floors and rustic beams. Lawrence stepped inside, letting the door close on the storm behind him. The sound felt final, like the world outside had been sealed away. A few travelers sat scattered throughout the cozy room. Some warmed their hands by the fire. Others sipped hot drinks that sent soft curls of steam into the air. Conversation drifted gently, hushed and warm, like murmurs wrapped in wool. At the far end of the room stood the innkeeper, a stout, cheerful man with a friendly round face and a sprig of holly tucked behind one ear. He looked up with surprise and immediate welcome. "Good heavens, sir!" he exclaimed, hurrying forward. "Out in that storm! Come in, quickly now. You must be frozen stiff." Lawrence managed a tired smile. Nearly, I'm afraid. The innkeeper guided him toward the hearth, where the fire glowed bright and comforting. As Lawrence stretched his hands toward the warmth, the ache in his fingers began to fade, replaced by a slow and soothing heat. "You're safe now," the innkeeper said kindly. "A storm like this will close the roads for hours yet, perhaps longer, but you're welcome to stay until it passes." Lawrence nodded gratefully. "Thank you, truly." The innkeeper smiled. "No need to thank me. The Holly Tree Inn is always open to travelers in need, especially so close to Christmas." Lawrence looked around. The room was beautiful in its simplicity. Garlands of evergreen draped along the mantelpiece. Red berries stood out like tiny sparks of color. Lanterns glowed softly along the walls, casting a warm, steady light. The air smelled faintly of pine, cinnamon, and wood smoke, a perfect refuge from the storm. As Lawrence settled into a cushioned chair near the fire, the innkeeper poured him a cup of steaming mulled cider. The drink warmed him instantly, spreading heat through his chest and easing the weariness in his limbs. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, everything was gentle. After a few quiet minutes, the innkeeper spoke again, his voice soft and almost conspiratorial. "You've arrived on a special night, you know." "Special?" Lawrence echoed. The innkeeper nodded, lowering his voice. "Whenever a snowstorm traps travelers here, especially so close to Christmas, it's a tradition of the Holly Tree Inn that each person shares a story. Some tell tales of their journeys, others speak of loved ones far away. A few share Christmas memories, and once in a great while, someone brings a tale filled with a touch of magic." Lawrence opened his eyes, curiosity stirring. "And tonight?" The innkeeper smiled, eyes twinkling. "Tonight we have a full house, and a long storm ahead, which means," he gestured around the room, "many stories waiting to be told." Lawrence felt a soft warmth swelling inside him, not just from the fire, but from the promise of something gentle and unexpected, the way only a winter night and a cozy inn could provide. He settled deeper into his chair. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Holly Tree Inn, a peaceful stillness wrapped around them all, like a blanket of Christmas light. And Lawrence had the distinct feeling that something magical was just beginning. Chapter 2. The Gathering Around the Hearth. The storm outside thickened as evening settled over the valley. Snow pressed softly against the windows of the Holly Tree Inn, layering the glass with delicate white lace. The wind whistled through the eaves, but inside the firelight grew warmer, stretching its golden glow across the wooden beams and filling every corner with a comforting hush. Lawrence Hartwell felt the warmth seep into his bones as he finished the last sip of his mulled cider. The taste of cinnamon lingered pleasantly on his tongue. Around the room, the other travelers had begun to settle in. Boots dried near the hearth, coats hung by the door, gloves steaming gently in the heat. It was the kind of winter evening that made the world outside feel distant and unreal, as though the inn were a small island glowing in a sea of snow. The innkeeper stepped forward, rubbing his hands together with a delighted smile. "Well then," he announced, "it seems the storm has no intention of letting up tonight, which means we may as well make ourselves comfortable for a good long while." A soft ripple of laughter drifted through the room. Lawrence glanced around at the faces of the other guests. There were 6 in all. A young woman with auburn hair wrapped in a deep green shawl. A tall, thin gentleman with spectacles fogged from the hearth's warmth. A pair of elderly sisters in matching knitted hats. A quiet man seated near the window, shadowed and thoughtful. And a boy of perhaps 10 curled up with a wool blanket and a curious gaze. Each of them seemed to glow gently in the firelight like characters from a painting brought to life. The innkeeper lifted a candle, its flame flickering with each subtle shift of the room. "As is our custom when winter traps us together," he said warmly, "we share stories. And tonight, I think we have just the right mix of strangers and snow to make the tradition a memorable one." He looked around expectantly. No one spoke at first. The quiet seemed to gather like a soft snowfall. Then the auburn-haired woman cleared her throat lightly. "I suppose someone must begin," she said, her voice gentle and melodic. "And I don't mind being the first." The innkeeper nodded with approval. "Very good, miss." "Clara," she said simply. "Clara Merriman." Lawrence felt something shift in the room. Attention, curiosity, a soft leaning in, as Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and gazed thoughtfully at the hearth. Her eyes glimmered with reflections of the fire. "My story," she began, "is not one of adventure or mischief. It is simply a memory, but a Christmas one. And perhaps that is enough on a night such as this." Lawrence relaxed into his chair, the warmth of the hearth smoothing the edge of the storm's distant howl. The others settled in as well, breaths quieting, eyes softening as Clara continued. "It was many years ago," she said, "when I was no older than that boy near the window." She smiled gently toward him, and he offered a shy nod in return. "Our village was small, smaller than this town, I believe, with only one lane of shops and a church bell that rang more often than our clock chimed. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters as if reminding them of the world beyond. But what I remember most of all," she said softly, "is the baker. His name was Mr. Holling. Every Christmas Eve, he would make a single loaf of sweetbread, dusted with sugar and orange peel, and he would leave it on the doorstep of someone who needed a blessing." The thin gentleman with spectacles nodded appreciatively, as though he already adored the story's simplicity. Clara's voice lowered into a tender hush. "One year, my family received it. A faint warmth filled the room, like the quiet glow that spreads through a candlelit chapel. We had very little that winter," Clara continued. "My mother had fallen ill, and my father's work was scarce. I remember the cold in our home. It clung to our clothes, our hands, our breath, everything. But that night we opened our door and found the sweetbread sitting in a small wooden box, wrapped with a red ribbon." She paused, smiling softly at the memory. "I'll never forget the smell of it. Warm sugar, orange zest, and cinnamon. It filled our house with a sweetness we had almost forgotten. My mother cried when she tasted it, not from sadness, but from the tenderness of being remembered. The elderly sisters wiped their eyes. Even the boy near the window leaned forward, his blanket slipping slightly. And so," Clara said, "every Christmas since, I have tried to do the same. Not always with bread, not always with food at all, but with something. Something small, something kind." Lawrence felt the story settle inside him like a soft blanket. The inn seemed quieter now, wrapped in a peaceful glow. The innkeeper nodded with deep appreciation. "That," he said gently, "is the heart of the Holly Tree Inn tradition. a kindness shared in the hush of winter. Clara bowed her head slightly, her smile lingering. A moment of silence followed, warm, reflective, content. Then the tall gentleman with spectacles cleared his throat. "If no one objects," he said in a soft, measured tone, "I might offer a story next." The innkeeper grinned. "By all means, Mr. Thatcher," the gentleman replied. "Jonathan Thatcher, and my story is, well, a bit stranger than Miss Merriman's." A curious shift rippled through the room. Lawrence leaned forward slightly, sensing the promise of something unusual. The fire crackled. Snow tapped gently at the windows. The storm whirled quietly beyond the walls. Inside the Holly Tree Inn, the warmth of storytelling grew richer, weaving strangers together like threads in a winter tapestry. Lawrence felt his heart settle. The night was young, the storm was deep, and the next story was just beginning. Chapter 3: Mr. Thatcher's Curious Tale. The fire crackled softly as Jonathan Thatcher adjusted his spectacles, their round frames catching glints of orange and gold from the hearth. He folded his hands neatly in his lap, clearing his throat with the calm precision of a man accustomed to libraries, ink, and quiet reflection. Outside, the storm deepened. Snow brushed against the windows like a soft, restless whisper. But inside the Holly Tree Inn, the warmth settled deeper into the walls, as though the room itself leaned closer to hear the next story. Jonathan looked around at the gathered faces, gentle, expectant, wrapped in the glow of candlelight, and offered a small, hesitant smile. "My story," he began, "is not precisely a Christmas memory, and yet it was a winter evening, much like this one. And I can't deny that the events changed the way I see this season forever." Lawrence shifted slightly in his chair, sensing the subtle tension in Jonathan's tone, an undercurrent of mystery beneath the quiet words. The gentleman continued, "It was 3 winters ago, on a night when I found myself quite lost on the country roads north of Hallowmere. I had been visiting an old colleague and left later than intended. Snow had begun to fall, heavy, persistent, and before long, the path I traveled disappeared entirely beneath it." Lawrence and Clara exchanged a knowing glance. The scene was all too familiar. "I wandered for what felt like hours," Jonathan said, "guided only by the dim glow of my lantern and the faint crunch of my own footsteps. Then, quite unexpectedly, I saw a shadow move between the trees." He paused, letting the room settle into a deeper quiet. "It was too tall to be a fox, too slender to be a stag. I raised my lantern, and in that pale golden glow, I glimpsed what I can only describe as a figure. A woman, draped in white." The boy near the window drew in a small breath. Jonathan nodded slowly, as though confirming his own memory. "She stood perfectly still, watching me. Her dress seemed woven from frost, shimmering as though made of thousands of tiny snowflakes. And when she moved, ever so slightly, the trees behind her glittered as if reflecting moonlight, though no moon was visible." Clara's eyes widened, but her expression remained soft, curious rather than fearful. "At first," Jonathan said, "I thought my mind had conjured the image from fatigue. But then she spoke. A soft shiver passed through the room. Her voice was unlike any I had heard. Gentle, yes, but distant, like wind passing through icy branches. She said, 'You should not be out here alone, traveler.'" The innkeeper leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Jonathan continued, "I asked if she needed help, but she only shook her head. Then she told me to follow her, for the storm would worsen, and the woods were not safe that night. He swallowed, his voice dipping to a near whisper. I followed her. I don't remember deciding to, only that my feet moved as she drifted ahead of me, guiding me through the snow as though she knew every hidden path between the trees. Lawrence felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck, not with fear, but with a soft, tugging wonder. After perhaps 10 minutes, Jonathan said, we reached a clearing, and there, tucked beneath an enormous holly tree, was a small cottage. Warm light glowed in the windows, smoke curled gently from the chimney, as though the house had been expecting me. Clara's lips parted. A holly tree, like this inn. Jonathan offered a faint smile. Indeed, a curious coincidence, if coincidence it was. He continued, I turned to thank the woman, but she was gone. Vanished, as though she had stepped backward into the snow and melted into it. The wind outside pressed softly against the glass, as if echoing the mystery. I knocked upon the cottage door, Jonathan said, his voice gentle. An elderly couple lived there, kind people, warm-hearted. They welcomed me in without hesitation, dried my coat, fed me soup, and gave me a bed by the fire. A thoughtful silence fell. In the morning, the storm had passed. When I asked the couple about the woman in white, they simply looked at me with confusion. No one travels these woods at night, they told me, not in winter. He removed his spectacles, rubbing their lenses with his sleeve, though they were already spotless. And when I stepped outside, the snow beneath the holly tree was untouched. No footprints but mine. The boy whispered, a spirit? Jonathan smiled softly. Perhaps. Or perhaps merely a winter dream given shape. All I know is this. Without her, I would not have found shelter that night, and every Christmas since, I find myself grateful for the kindness of strangers, seen or unseen. A gentle warmth filled the room. Clara pressed a hand to her heart. That was beautiful, Mr. Thatcher. The elderly sisters dabbed at their eyes. The innkeeper nodded thoughtfully, as though pondering the mystery himself. Lawrence felt something quiet and peaceful settle inside him, a recognition that winter held wonders far beyond the ordinary. Jonathan placed his spectacles back on his nose and folded his hands once more. That, he said with a small smile, is my contribution. The fire crackled, sending a soft cascade of sparks up the chimney. After a few moments of reflective silence, the innkeeper straightened, his eyes drifting to the quiet man near the window, the one who had not spoken since Lawrence entered. He sat still as a shadow, one hand resting on the windowsill, eyes watching the snowfall outside, with an expression both distant and tender. The innkeeper nodded toward him. Mr. Whitcomb, he said gently, would you care to share the next story? The man looked up slowly. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft as falling snow. I suppose, he murmured, it is time. And just like that, the next story began to gather itself in the quiet air of the Holly Tree Inn. Chapter 4. Mr. Whitcomb's Winter Memory. The quiet man by the window straightened slowly, as though pulled gently from a long and distant thought. Mr. Whitcomb was his name. Lawrence remembered hearing it in passing, but until now he had spoken little, offering only polite nods and soft murmurs when addressed. Now, as all eyes turned toward him, he rested his hands on his knees and looked into the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes like tiny flickering stars. For a while he said nothing. The innkeeper gave him a reassuring nod. Only if you wish, Mr. Whitcomb. No story is required here. but Mr. Whitcomb shook his head gently. "No, I believe I should tell it. I have not shared this memory in many years." The room quieted. Even the storm seemed to hush its breath, as though leaning in. Whitcomb exhaled softly, the sound a fragile thread in the warm, still air. "My story," he began, "is from a Christmas long past. I was a younger man then, just 20 perhaps, and full of that particular confidence young people carry like an extra coat. I believed I knew the world, believed I could bend it to my will. But winter has a way of teaching humility." The elderly sisters nodded knowingly. Whitcomb continued, his voice steady but touched with something gentle. Sorrow, perhaps, softened by time. "I lived with my mother in a small cottage near the coast. She was a quiet woman, kind, patient, with hands always busy and eyes always thoughtful. That year, money was scarce, and she worked tirelessly sewing garments for people in the village. I helped where I could, though my pride often got in the way." He drew a slow breath. "That Christmas Eve, I had been out late with friends, celebrating more loudly than wisely. A storm rolled in, quick, fierce, and full of icy wind. My friends returned home before it worsened, but I insisted I could make the walk alone." Lawrence felt a chill run beneath his skin, recognizing the familiar sting of youthful stubbornness. "The storm swallowed me," Whitcomb said quietly. "Snow stung my face, the wind pushed me off the path, and soon I could not tell where the village ended and the hills began. My lantern blew out, my coat soaked through, every direction felt the same, white, cold, and endless." He clasped his hands, knuckles pale in the firelight. "I remember falling. Twice perhaps, maybe more. The world tilted. My thoughts slowed. And somewhere in the blur of it all, I realized how foolish I had been. How my mother must have been waiting for me, terrified, staring out the window as the storm swallowed everything." Clara pressed a hand to her heart. Whitcomb's voice grew softer still. "Eventually, I lost all sense of the road. My legs refused to move, and the cold dug into me like claws. I remember kneeling in the snow, thinking, 'This is how it ends.' The boy near the window held his breath. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter. And then," Whitcomb whispered, "I saw a light." Lawrence leaned forward. "Faint at first, a small glow, bobbing gently through the darkness. I thought it a trick of my fading senses. But the light grew brighter, warmer, closer." Whitcomb paused, eyes distant with memory. It was my mother. A soft gasp passed through the room, quiet, reverent. "She had taken her lantern," he continued, "wrapped herself in 3 shawls and walked into the storm to find me. She called my name, though the wind nearly swallowed her voice. Somehow, through pure determination, I suppose, or perhaps some miracle of a mother's heart, she found me." The firelight trembled, reflecting the emotion tightening his voice. "She lifted me beneath her arm and walked with me, slowly, painfully, back toward the cottage. I could barely stand, let alone walk, but she didn't give up. Not for a second. The whole way home she whispered, 'Just a little farther, my boy. A little farther.'" The inn was silent now. Even those who had been smiling moments before felt their eyes prick with emotion. "When we reached the cottage," Whitcomb said, "she sat me by the fire, wrapped me in blankets, and warmed my hands with her own. She brewed broth and scolded me and cried and laughed through her tears. And when morning came, she rang the small brass bell she kept by the window, the the one she always rang on Christmas mornings. He smiled faintly. That sound, that gentle ringing, became Christmas to me, a reminder that love is often quiet, patient, and stronger than any storm. Clara brushed a tear from her cheek. The elderly sisters nodded with trembling smiles. Even the innkeeper's eyes shone softly. Whitcomb looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. She passed a few years later, but every Christmas Eve, when the snow begins to fall, I hear that little bell in my memory. And I know I was saved by more than luck. I was saved by love. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled gently, the storm sighed against the windows, and warmth wrapped around the room like a soft wool blanket. At last, the innkeeper spoke, his voice warm with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Whitcomb. That was beautiful." Whitcomb offered a modest nod, folding his hands again. Lawrence felt the story settle deep inside him, a gentle ache, a reminder of the fragile, priceless threads that connect us to those we love. After a few moments of quiet reflection, the boy near the window shifted slightly, lifting his blanket as though gathering courage. "If it's all right," he said in a timid voice, I have a story too." The innkeeper smiled warmly. "Of course, my boy. Every story is welcome here." The fire glowed brighter, as though leaning closer. The boy cleared his throat softly, and a new story began. Chapter 5: The Boy's Candlelight Tale. The boy shifted in his chair, pulling the wool blanket a little closer around his shoulders. His cheeks were rosy from the fire's glow, his eyes bright but hesitant, like someone holding a secret story for the first time. Everyone in the Holly Tree Inn turned toward him with gentle curiosity. The innkeeper offered an encouraging nod. "Take your time," he said warmly. "No rush." The boy swallowed, his fingers tightening on the blanket. "My name is Peter," he said in a small voice, "Peter Alden. And my story is, it's not very long, but it's true. And it happened last Christmas Eve." Lawrence smiled softly. "A true story is always enough." Peter exhaled, as if that reassurance had lifted a small weight from his chest. "Well," he began, "it was snowing that night. Maybe not as much as today, but enough that the roads were quiet. My father works late sometimes, and last year he had promised he'd be home in time to light the Christmas candle with us. We always light it together, right when the first star appears. My mother says it welcomes peace into the house." The elderly sisters murmured approvingly. "But," Peter continued, "the clock kept getting later, and the snow kept piling up, and my mother kept checking the window. She tried to smile, but I could tell she was worried. Outside, a gust of wind swept across the inn's wooden walls, as if echoing the memory. I stood with her for a long time," Peter said quietly. "We didn't talk. We just waited. And the snow outside our door kept getting higher and higher." He paused, his voice softening. It felt like the whole world was turning white. Clara leaned forward, her shawl falling gently across her shoulder. "Did he make it home?" she asked softly. Peter nodded, though he didn't smile. "He did, but not right away." He glanced toward the fire, watching the sparks drift upward. "Just when we thought we might have to light the candle without him, there was a sound at the door. A soft thump. My mother opened it, and there he was, covered in snow from his boots to his hat. He looked so tired and so cold. But he smiled at us, like he'd just reached the warmest place in the world." Lawrence felt warmth tug at his heart. Peter's voice quieted to a whisper. He hugged us both, but he told us he'd walked the last mile on foot because the snow was too deep for the carriage, and he said he'd kept going because he didn't want us to welcome Christmas without him. The room fell into a tender hush. But, Peter continued, when we sat down to light the candle, he stopped us. He said he wanted to show us something. Peter's fingers loosened on the blanket as memory softened his expression. He reached into his coat and took out a little wooden star. He said he'd carved it on his breaks at work so he could surprise us. He hung it above the candle holder, and when we lit the candle, Peter hesitated, searching for the right words. The star glowed. Not just from the candlelight. It felt brighter, warmer, like it was shining from the inside. The innkeeper raised his brows, intrigued. Was it magic? The boy asked quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. I don't know. My father said it was just the candlelight catching the wood in a special way. But I've seen candles my whole life. They don't glow like that. The boy's eyes lifted, filled with a simple, sincere wonder. It felt like Christmas itself was shining. A gentle silence followed, one filled not with mystery, but with pure warmth. Clara smiled through slightly misty eyes. Jonathan Thatcher nodded approvingly. Mr. Whitcomb looked thoughtful, his expression softening. Lawrence felt a glow settle inside him, like the memory of a candle's first flame. That's a beautiful story, Peter, Lawrence said softly. Sometimes the smallest lights carry the greatest warmth. Peter's cheeks flushed, this time with shy pride. Thank you, he murmured. The innkeeper stepped forward again, his hands clasped cheerfully. Well, he said with a bright smile, we have heard stories of kindness, wonder, hardship, and hope. And if the storm outside keeps us much longer, we may hear even more. A few chuckles rippled through the room. But, he continued, there is still one person who has yet to speak. Lawrence looked up, startled. Me? He asked softly. The innkeeper grinned. Indeed, Mr. Hartwell, if you are willing. Lawrence felt a warmth of nerves flutter in his chest. He hadn't expected to share anything, not tonight, not among strangers. But as he looked around at the circle of gentle faces glimmering in the firelight, he felt a quiet invitation settle over him. The storm raged softly behind the walls. Inside, the Holly Tree Inn glowed like a lantern in the snow. And Lawrence realized that he, too, had a story to tell. A story that winter had shaped. A story he had not spoken aloud in many years. He took a slow breath. I suppose, he said quietly, I do have something to share. The room leaned in. The fire flickered, and Lawrence began to gather the words of a memory that had long slept in his heart. The fire. The warmth shimmered gently in the air, casting slow-moving shadows along the beams above. Outside, the snowstorm rolled on, steady and tireless, whispering against the windows like a distant lullaby. Everyone waited, not with impatience, but with the kind of patient curiosity that grows only on winter nights when time feels soft and unhurried. Lawrence took a breath. My story, he began, takes place a long time ago. Longer than I'd care to admit. His voice was warm, touched with a gentle nostalgia. I was a younger man then, not quite settled with myself. I had traveled often, too often perhaps, wandering from town to town, never staying long enough to grow roots. Clara tilted her head thoughtfully, her shawl glowing soft green in the firelight. It was the winter after my father passed, Lawrence continued. My mother was alone in our family home, and though I had promised to visit her for Christmas, I delayed. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to face the empty chair at her hearth. His voice softened. Sometimes grief makes cowards of us. No one spoke. The inn's warmth wrapped gently around the quiet words. The day before Christmas Eve, Lawrence said, I finally set out for home. The road wound through hills, much like these, lined with pine and holly. Snow began to fall lightly at first, then heavier, until the road was barely visible. He paused, gazing into the fire. But the snow wasn't what slowed me. It was the weight of memory. Of the Christmases before, when my father's laughter filled the house, and I never imagined a holiday could feel cold on the inside. Clara breathed in softly, her eyes glimmering with empathy. I camped by a frozen brook that night, Lawrence went on, and the cold was sharper than I expected. I remember sitting near my little fire, watching the sparks drift upward like lost stars, and thinking how foolish I had been, not only to delay my journey, but to carry my sorrow alone. His gaze softened, distant. And then something happened. Lawrence leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a quiet hush. I heard footsteps in the snow. The boy, Peter, pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. At first, I thought it might be a deer, or perhaps the shifting of the trees. But then I saw a figure approaching, a woman. Not a spirit or a vision, he added with a faint smile toward Jonathan Thatcher, but a traveler like myself. He rested his hands gently on the arms of his chair. She introduced herself as Miriam. Her voice was kind, her eyes steady. She said she had seen my fire from the road and wondered if she might share its warmth. Whitcomb nodded slowly, quiet understanding flickering in his expression. I welcomed her, Lawrence said, and we spoke through much of the night. Not loudly, not urgently, just two strangers sharing small stories to keep the cold away. He took a soft breath. At some point, I told her about my father, about the empty chair, about how heavy it felt to return home to a place that would never be the same. The room was so still that even the fire seemed to listen more gently. Miriam didn't say much at first, Lawrence continued, but when she did speak, her words were simple, and I have never forgotten them. He looked up, his eyes calm and warm. She said, Christmas doesn't ask us to forget our sorrow. It only asks that we don't face it alone. A soft exhale passed through the room. Clara, perhaps, or the elderly sisters, or all of them together. Her words eased something in me, Lawrence said quietly. I still felt the ache of loss, but it felt different. Warmer somehow, like a candle lit in a dark room. He leaned back slightly, the firelight brushing his features with soft amber. In the morning, she shared her breakfast with me, a small loaf of bread and a bit of dried fruit. Then we parted ways. She headed east, I headed west. And though I never saw her again, I carried her kindness with me. A gentle silence settled, deep and peaceful. When I reached home, Lawrence said, my mother was standing by the window watching the road. And when she saw me, she didn't scold or question or ask why I had taken so long. He smiled softly. She simply opened the door, wrapped me in her arms and said, Welcome home, my son. A warm ache filled the inn. That evening, Lawrence added quietly, we lit a candle together for my father. The candle flickered as though stirred by a soft breath, and for the first time that winter, I felt at peace. He looked up and offered a gentle smile to the circle. Ever since that night, I've believed that Christmas is built on small kindnesses, shared by strangers, remembered by family, carried from one winter to the next." The innkeeper exhaled with heartfelt warmth. "Well said," he murmured. "Well said indeed." The fire crackled softly, the storm pressed gently against the walls, and the Holly Tree Inn seemed to glow brighter, filled with the warmth of shared stories. After a long, peaceful moment, the innkeeper stood. "My friends," he said, "Christmas Eve is nearly upon us. The storm will pass in time, but until then, the hearth is warm, our company kind, and the night is still young." He raised his mug. "To travelers, to homecomings, and to the gentle magic of Christmas." The others lifted their cups in quiet unison, their faces soft with gratitude. Lawrence felt a deep, comforting peace settle within him. The storm outside no longer felt like something to endure. It felt like part of the night's tapestry, a reminder that warmth shines brightest in winter. And inside the Holly Tree Inn, wrapped in light and calm and stories shared between strangers, Christmas had already begun.